The crimson drops guided him directly to the stone well. In his 37 years working this harsh frontier ranch, Tobias Hartwell had witnessed enough injured wildlife to distinguish between deer's blood and something altogether different. Yet when he traced those scarlet marks past the barn's edge, the sight that greeted him made his grip tighten on his Winchester. A wounded Native American brave collapsed against his well-stone foundation, pressing one palm frantically against a torn gash along his ribs, while the other stretched feebly toward the wooden water bucket dangling mere feet overhead. The warrior's chest rose and fell in ragged, agonized rhythms, his coal-black eyes cutting through the haze of suffering to follow Tobias's every motion with the wariness of prey expecting predators from all angles. In 1847, discovering an Indian on your land signified only one outcome: catastrophe. The variety that left men scalped before dawn or roasted alive inside their own cabins. Every rancher for 50 miles around would counsel Tobias identically: plant a lead ball in the savage's skull and enter him where none would locate the remains. Tobias lifted his rifle, his index finger floating above the trigger mechanism. The intelligent choice, the secure choice, the anticipated choice. Yet something within those obsidian eyes halted him completely. Beyond mere physical agony, he recognized something else entirely. The identical parching desperation he'd experienced during the terrible dry spell of 1844, when he'd endured 3 waterless days, believing death was imminent. The same fundamental human craving that surpassed complexion, dialect, or which faction of conflict claimed your birth. The brave attempted speech, his mouth split and bloodied, producing only the faintest whisper: water. Tobias dropped his weapon and grasped the bucket. His fellow settlers would brand him mad. His sibling back in civilization would declare frontier isolation had corrupted his judgment. Perhaps they'd prove correct. But kneeling beside this injured outsider, guiding the wooden rim between his lips and observing him drink like someone rescued from drowning, Tobias understood one absolute truth: he was about to transform both their destinies permanently. What Tobias couldn't foresee was that this bleeding warrior represented far more than merely another tribal member. The events that followed would draw more horsemen to his property than he'd witnessed throughout his entire existence. The Indian consumed water like someone deprived for countless days. 3 complete buckets before his shaking hands could maintain a steady grip. Tobias monitored each swallow, his thoughts racing with the consequences of his actions. In this territory, demonstrating compassion toward an Indian equaled endorsing your own execution. But his vitality gradually returned to the warrior's features. Tobias observed something that chilled his blood. The gash along the man's torso hadn't resulted from beast attacks or hunting mishaps. A bullet wound, recent, still weeping, and considering the trajectory plus powder residue surrounding the entry point, someone had fired at point-blank range. Very recent point-blank range, meaning whoever had inflicted this injury might continue pursuing him, might be following that identical blood trail leading directly to Tobias's ranch, might be approaching his land presently with loaded firearms and inquiries Tobias couldn't address. The Indian appeared to detect his alarm. Summoning considerable effort, he lifted one hand toward the distant horizon, then drew it across his throat in a slashing gesture. His communication was unmistakable. Peril approached swiftly. Tobias felt his pulse pounding against his chest. Every survival instinct demanded he remove this wounded stranger from his premises. Eliminate the proof. Act as though nothing had occurred. But the man could barely maintain an upright position, much less ambulate. Relocating him now would likely prove fatal. Abandoning him here resembled painting targets on both their spines. Then Tobias detected it, the sound that had preserved his life through 12 frontier years. Hoofbeats approaching, multiple mounts advancing rapidly and purposefully, heading straight for his ranch. The Indian heard them as well. His eyes expanded with unmistakable terror, and he struggled to press himself against the well, as though minimizing his presence might render him invisible. Blood immediately began flowing between his fingers where they covered his wound. Tobias seized the empty bucket and doused the blood trail as rapidly as possible, but insufficient time remained for thorough cleaning. The riders would arrive within minutes, perhaps less. He gazed down at the wounded warrior, this stranger who had stumbled into his existence and inverted it completely within a single afternoon. A man whose presence on his ranch could destroy them both, yet whose dark eyes contained something Tobias had never witnessed in an Indian previously: appreciation. Genuine human appreciation. The hoofbeats grew nearer, close enough to enumerate them. 5 horses, possibly 6, all maintaining a gallop, suggesting their visit wasn't social. Tobias reached his decision in that instant, knowing it might represent his final choice ever. He couldn't transport the wounded man, but concealment remained possible. The abandoned root cellar behind the barn, assuming they could reach it. But as he extended his hand to assist the Indian upright, the warrior grasped his wrist with unexpected strength and slowly shook his head. Then he performed something that made Tobias's flesh crawl. He smiled, not the grateful expression of someone being rescued, but the knowing smile of someone who understood precisely who was cresting that hill. The riders appeared over the ridge like storm clouds bearing lightning. 6 mounted men, dust clouds trailing behind them, rifles gleaming in the afternoon light. Tobias immediately recognized the lead rider, Marshal Dixon Webb, a man whose violent reputation preceded him into every settlement from here to Santa Fe. Webb represented the type of lawman who fired first and investigated later, particularly regarding Indian conflicts. The type who collected scalps as souvenirs and labeled it justice. The type who would incinerate a ranch and everyone within if he suspected them of sheltering fugitives. Tobias positioned himself before the well, his body concealing the Indian from view, attempting to appear like someone whose greatest concern involved repairing a damaged fence post. His mouth felt parched as desert sand. Webb reined his horse just 10 feet away, close enough for Tobias to observe the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The remaining 5 men dispersed in a semicircle, hands resting on their weapons. This wasn't a courtesy call. "Afternoon, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone who knew he controlled the situation. "We're tracking a wounded Indian. Blood trail leads directly to your property." Tobias felt perspiration forming on his brow despite the cool evening air. "Haven't seen any Indians, Marshal. Been working the south fence all day." Webb's gaze swept across the ranch, absorbing every detail. The man overlooked nothing. That's what made him so dangerous. His attention lingered on the dark stains in the dirt near the well, and Tobias felt his stomach plummet. "Is that so?" Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately, "Because that certainly looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. And unless you've been slaughtering cattle beside your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently." Behind Tobias, hidden by the well's stone wall, the wounded Indian remained motionless, but Tobias could sense the tension emanating from him like heat from furnace. One sound, one movement, and they were both corpses. Webb stepped 3 paces closer, his hand now resting openly on his pistol. "You know what the penalty is for harboring Indian fugitives, don't you, Hartwell? It's identical to the penalty for treason. A rope around the neck until dead." The words suspended in the air like a death sentence. Tobias felt every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring, prepared to fight or flee, knowing neither option would preserve him. Webb was too near now. Any sudden movement would reveal the Indian, and once that occurred, bullets would begin flying. Then something impossible happened. The wounded Indian spoke, not in English, but in his native language, a stream of words that flowed like music, clear and powerful despite his injuries. Words that made Marshal Webb freeze mid-stride, and color drained from his face like water from a broken vessel. Webb's hand dropped away from his pistol. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. When he finally discovered his voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Dear God, you're him." The other 5 riders immediately dismounted, their weapons forgotten. Their faces displayed the same mixture of shock and something resembling fear, but not the kind of fear men show when confronting an enemy. The kind of fear men show when they realize they've just committed a terrible, terrible error. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now pale as winter snow. "Do you have any idea who you've been helping?" Tobias stared at Marshal Webb's terrified expression, his mind spinning like a wagon while trapped in mud. In 12 years of frontier existence, he'd never witnessed the ruthless lawmen display fear of anything. Not outlaws, not wild beasts, not even the Apache war parties that had reduced 3 settlements to ashes just last summer. But now, Webb appeared like someone who had just encountered Spectre. The wounded Indian spoke again, this time in perfect English, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire ranch. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to locate me." Webb's atoms apple-bobbed as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like an adolescent's. "This is Ayanna, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring." Tobias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The peace treaty. The same treaty that had ended 3 years of brutal warfare between the settlers and the Apache. The same treaty that had preserved hundreds of lives on both sides. The same treaty that had made it safe for families to settle in this territory without fear of midnight raids. And he'd been giving water to the man who'd made it all possible. But if Ayanna was a peacemaker, why was he fleeing from the law with a bullet in his side? "There was an ambush," Ayanna continued, his breathing still labored, but his voice growing stronger with each word. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about expanding the treaty to include the Southern Territories. But Morrison had other plans. Webb's face went from pale to gray. "Colonel Morrison is dead, shot in the back during an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder." "That's what they want you to believe," Ayanna said, pushing himself up straighter against the wall. "Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough Apache to fool the witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we would meet." The implication struck Tobias like a physical blow. Someone had staged Morrison's murder to frame Ayanna. Someone who wanted the peace treaty destroyed. Someone who wanted the territory to burn again. "Who?" Webb asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Ayanna's dark eyes hardened like flint. "The same men who've been selling guns to the renegade tribes. The same men who've been making a fortune off this war. The same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of looking for the real killers." Webb took a step backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon before stopping. "You're talking about treason, about corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations. And they'll remain accusations until I can prove them," Ayanna replied. "Which is why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they put a bullet in me and left me for dead. Why they're counting on men like you to finish what they started." Tobias watched this exchange with growing dread. He'd thought he was just helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he'd stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that could tear the entire territory apart. But what chilled him most was the realization that if Ayanna was telling the truth, then Marshal Webb hadn't come here to arrest a fugitive. He'd come here to commit murder. The silence stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Webb's 5 men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands hovering near weapons, eyes darting between their marshal and the wounded Apache who had just accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could see the war happening behind Webb's eyes. The marshal was trapped between duty and truth, between orders and conscience. And men like Webb didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually solved them with bullets. Even if what you're saying is true, Webb said slowly, I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I'm supposed to bring you back dead or alive. Dead would be more convenient, Ayanna replied. His voice steady despite the pain etched across his face. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't reveal who really benefits from another Indian war. One of Webb's men, a young deputy with nervous eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Marshal, if he's telling the truth about the peace treaty. Shut up, Bradley, Webb snapped. But Tobias could see doubt creeping into the marshal's expression like cracks in a dam wall. That's when Ayanna played his final card, reaching into a leather pouch at his belt with trembling fingers. He pulled out a folded piece of paper stained with blood. This is why they tried to kill me. A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb stared at the letter like it might burst into flames. What does it say? It says Morrison discovered who's been supplying weapons to the renegade tribes. Names, dates, amounts. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Ayanna's eyes never left Webb's face, including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been taking bribes to look the other way. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His face went through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly green. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very interested in examining their horses' manes. Tobias sensed his pulse thundering against his chest. He was observing something that could destroy them all. The instant when a crooked lawman grasped that his own head was destined for the executioner's block. You're fabricating lies, Webb declared, though his voice carried no certainty. Am I? Ayanna raised the letter. Morrison placed enough trust in me to deliver this the evening he perished. Instructed me to transport it to Fort Richardson should anything befall him. Called to protection. Webb advanced one step, his hand now clutching his revolver. Hand over that document so you can eliminate it. Ayanna declined with a head shake. I think not, Marshal, but I'll propose a bargain. Allow me to survive long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow, and I'll ensure your name remains unmentioned when this truth emerges. The proposition lingered in the atmosphere like smoke from discharged gunpowder. Tobias observed Webb calculating probabilities, measuring dangers, attempting to determine which decision would preserve his life longer. But what occurred next astonished everyone. Deputy Bradley dismounted and approached the well slowly, his hands elevated peacefully. Marshal, I've been contemplating something. Recall that rifle shipment that vanished 3 months past? The one we were informed was pilfered by Indians. Webb's expression darkened. What concerning it? I observed those identical rifles 2 weeks afterward in the possession of settlers traveling south. Bradley's youthful face flushed with either bravery or terror. Made me question who was truly stealing from whom. The confession fractured something within the group. Suddenly, other deputies were nodding, exchanging looks, recalling incidents that hadn't made sense previously. Tobias realized that Ayanna had just accomplished something extraordinary. Without discharging a weapon or elevating his voice, he turned Webb's own subordinates against him. But Webb wasn't the type of man who surrendered without resistance. And when trapped, perilous men performed perilous deeds. Webb's grip on his pistol tightened until his knuckles turned white. A cornered beast is always most lethal, and Tobias witnessed the precise moment when the marshal decided that bullets were simpler than truth. You're all imbeciles, Webb growled, his mask of courtesy finally falling away. You believe this savage's testimony means anything against mine? You think anyone will credit the word of a deceased Indian and a handful of betrayers. The deputies dispersed instinctively, hands moving toward their weapons. But Tobias detected the uncertainty in their expressions. Years of obeying commands battled against the growing realization that those commands might be erroneous. Ayanna struggled upright, using the stone well for support. Blood seeped between his fingers where he pressed them against his wound, but his voice remained firm. Truth doesn't care who speaks it, Marshal. It simply exists. The truth, Webb spat, is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm going to claim the reward on your head. He drew his pistol in one fluid motion, the barrel swinging toward Ayanna. But before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped directly into trajectory, his own weapon raised. Stand down, Marshal. The words exploded like thunder across the ranch. For other deputies followed Bradley's example, their guns trained on their own commanding officer. Only one man remained faithful to Webb, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins who appeared as corrupt as his superior. You're committing an error, boys, Webb said, though perspiration now formed on his brow. An error that'll cost you your badges, perhaps your lives. Perhaps, Bradley replied, but I've committed enough errors following your commands. I won't commit any more. Tobias observed this confrontation with mounting apprehension. 6 armed men in his ranch yard, all aiming guns at each other, all convinced they were righteous. This was how territorial wars began. This was how good men perished for evil reasons. That's when Ayanna did something unexpected. He began to chant not in English, but in Apache, a low, haunting melody that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The ancient words carried across the ranch like wind through canyon walls, speaking of honor and sacrifice, of brothers who stood united against darkness. The effect was immediate and striking. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, not comprehending the words, but sensing their power. Even Webb seemed momentarily captivated by the sound. And while they listened transfixed, Ayanna was accomplishing something else entirely. He was summoning his people. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening breeze to ears that knew how to interpret. Tobias realized this with a chill that ran down his spine like ice water. Ayanna wasn't merely chanting. He was calling forth. The melody concluded and silence descended over the ranch like a heavy blanket. But in that silence, Tobias heard something that made his blood freeze. Hoofbeats, distant but approaching. Many hoofbeats moving rapidly. Webb heard them as well. His face went pale as moonlight. How many? Ayanna smiled, despite his pain. Sufficient. The sound grew louder, multiplying until it resembled thunder rolling across the plains. Not 6 riders this time, not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was riding toward Tobias's ranch, and they would arrive within minutes. Webb raised his pistol again, this time pointing it directly at Tobias's chest. You caused this. You helped him signal them. I gave a dying man water, Tobias replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Same as I do for any creature suffering on my land. The hoofbeats were close enough now to feel in the ground beneath their feet. Close enough to count. Too many to count. And Webb finally understood what Ayanna had been planning all along. They came over the horizon like a vision from another realm. 50 Apache warriors on horseback moving in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the dying sunlight. But as they drew closer, Tobias realized something that defied everything he thought he knew about Indian war parties. They weren't coming for battle. At the head of the group rode an elderly chief whose presence commanded respect from 100 yards away. His gray hair was braided with eagle feathers, and despite his age, he sat his horse with the dignity of a man who had never bowed to anyone. Behind him rode warriors of every age, from seasoned fighters to young braves barely old enough to carry weapons. But their weapons remained sheathed. Webb's face cycled through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation. He still held his pistol trained on Tobias, but his hand shook like a man with fever. "This changes nothing. I still have my orders." "Your orders," came a new voice, "are no longer valid." Everyone turned to see Deputy Bradley holding up an official-looking document. "This came through this morning, Marshal, direct from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Ayanna is suspended pending investigation into Colonel Morrison's death." Webb's face went purple with rage. "You lying piece of—" "Check your own dispatch pouch," Bradley interrupted. "Unless you've been too busy collecting bounties to read your official mail." The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the ranch, not threatening, but unmistakably present. Their chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the well where his son waited. With each step, the old man's eyes never left Ayanna's face, searching for signs of serious injury. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled warriors. Tobias found himself witnessing something sacred. The reunion of a leader with his people, a father with his child, a peace negotiator with those he'd sworn to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his weathered hands checking the wound, his face grave with concern. Ayanna responded in the same language, but Tobias caught enough English mixed in to understand the essence, the truth, the conspiracy, the names of the real killers. When the conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb with eyes like black diamonds. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise. "Marshal Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him." Webb's pistol wavered. "I came here to arrest a fugitive." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief replied. "A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have been profiting from war between our peoples." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Webb's remaining ally, Hawkins, was slowly backing his horse away from the circle, clearly calculating his chances of escape. "You have no proof," Webb said, but his voice cracked on the words. The chief smiled, not warmly, but with the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "We have Morrison's letter. We have the testimony of the Real killers who confessed everything before they died trying to escape our justice. And we have something else." He gestured to one of his warriors, who rode forward carrying a leather satchel. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen. "Your correspondence with the gun runners," the chief continued. "Every payment, every shipment, every lie you told to cover your tracks. Morrison was more thorough than you knew." Webb's world collapsed in that moment. Tobias watched a corrupt man realize that all his schemes, all his violence, all his betrayals had been for nothing. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses reliable, the justice inevitable. But cornered animals were unpredictable. Webb swung his pistol toward the chief, desperation overriding common sense. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." What happened next moved faster than thought. Ayanna threw himself between the gun and his father despite his wound. The pistol fired, and 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in perfect unison. But the shot went wild because Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who just wanted to help a thirsty man, had tackled Marshal Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and rage. The dust settled like a curtain falling on the final act of a play. Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias, his pistol thrown clear by the impact. Deputy Bradley and his men quickly secured both Webb and Hawkins, while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons. But it was what happened next that would stay with Tobias for the rest of his life. The chief walked slowly to where Tobias sat, catching his breath in the dirt. The old man's weathered face showed no expression as he studied this white rancher who had risked everything for a stranger. Then, without warning, He placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache words that carried the weight of ceremony, of honor, of recognition. Ayanna translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says you are now brother to our people. What you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear. These are the actions of a true warrior. Tobias felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening to let in light he'd never seen before. All his life, he'd been taught that Indians were savages, enemies, obstacles to civilization. But looking into the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he'd never earned from his own people. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Tobias had ever witnessed. The Apache warriors dismounted and formed a circle around him. One by one, they approached and touched his hand, not a handshake in the white man's fashion, but something deeper, a recognition of kinship that transcended skin color or culture. When the last warrior had paid his respects, the chief presented Tobias with a gift that took his breath away, a war lance decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork, its shaft worn smooth by generations of hands. This belonged to my grandfather, the chief explained, and his grandfather before him. It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache, until today. As the sun set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Apache prepared to depart. Ayanna's wound had been properly treated by the tribal medicine man, and though he was still weak, he would live to see the peace treaty expanded and the real conspirators brought to justice. Before mounting his horse, Ayanna clasped Tobias's hand one final time. You saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples. I just gave a thirsty man some water, Tobias replied. Sometimes, Ayanna smiled. That's how the world changes. One cup of water at a time. 24 hours later, they were gone. But they left behind something precious. Proof that in a world full of hatred and fear, simple human decency could still work miracles. Webb and Hawkins were tried and convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The gun-running operation was dismantled, and the peace treaty was not only renewed but expanded to include all the tribes of the territory. And Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who had shown mercy to a stranger, became the first white man in territorial history to be formally adopted into the Apache Nation. Because sometimes in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles weren't won with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful: the courage to see enemies as human beings and the wisdom to choose compassion over fear. Marcus Thorne gazed across the desolate landscape where 70 Apache horsemen remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed upon him. They had maintained this vigil since sunrise, silent as ancient monuments, neither approaching nor withdrawing, simply observing. His hand drifted to the vacant leather holster on his hip, seeking not a missing weapon, but comfort that proved equally elusive. 24 hours ago, that same rocky outcrop had stood empty. 24 hours ago, he had made a decision that appeared straightforward. 24 hours ago, he had surrendered his soul mount to transport an injured Apache woman to shelter, abandoning himself 40 miles from civilization. Now these 70 braves clutched objects that defied explanation. Every warrior held a pristine white plume, yet Marcus had never witnessed Apaches employ such feathers for any purpose. Not in battle decoration, not in rituals he'd observed, nothing. The woman, Kaya, she had breathed her name before succumbing to fever, was absent from their ranks. Marcus had anticipated hostility. He had braced for war whoops. He had prepared to answer for trespassing on Apache lands, despite his noble intentions. Instead, they merely observed him, and that stillness felt more menacing than any battle cry could have been. Through his frontier years, Marcus understood one constant: Apaches never acted without purpose. Whatever motive drove 70 warriors to assume perfect formation, brandishing white plumes while studying a solitary, defenseless cowboy, that motive remained beyond his comprehension. Yet as the morning sun ascended higher, creating elongated shadows between him and the silent sentries, Marcus began understanding that surrendering his horse had initiated something profound, something governed by laws he never knew existed, something that would extract more from him than he ever thought possible. The mystery wasn't their desires. The mystery was what he had already committed to without realizing it. Yesterday's memory seared through Marcus's consciousness as he examined the motionless warriors. He had been traversing the gorge when he detected faint groaning reverberating off stone walls. Pursuing the sound, he discovered her collapsed near a parched stream bed, crimson seeping through crude bandaging around her thigh. The injury appeared septic, and fever scorched her flesh. Any reasonable man would have departed. Apache territory spelled doom for intruders, and assisting one of their women could invite insult or worse. But something in Kaya's obsidian eyes had frozen him completely. Not entreaty exactly, but dignified acceptance that evoked his sister's final moments. Marcus had hoisted Kaya onto his mount without hesitation. She was too weak to object, drifting between consciousness and delirium as he guided the animal on foot through treacherous terrain. For 7 hours he walked beside his horse while she swayed in the saddle, occasionally murmuring Apache phrases he couldn't decipher. When they finally reached her territory's boundary, marked by 3 distinctive crimson boulders, he helped her dismount and watched her stagger toward distant traditional shelters. Then he had done something that still bewildered him. Rather than reclaiming his horse, he struck the animal's hindquarters and sent it trailing after her. The horse pursued Kaya like a devoted hound, and Marcus stood there empty-handed, watching his most precious possession vanish into Apache territory. Now 20 hours later, his limbs throbbed from walking through darkness. His water supply was nearly exhausted, and 70 Apache warriors regarded him like an enigma requiring solution. The white plumes caught morning radiance, yet their significance remained as cryptic as the silence stretching between Ridge and Marcus's position. One warrior, distinguished by silver threading his raven hair, lifted his hand slightly. The others responded immediately, shifting their mounts into a different arrangement, not threatening but purposeful, calculated, like chess pieces moving according to rules Marcus had never mastered. The lead warrior began descending the ridge, still grasping his white plume. The others remained frozen, but Marcus sensed their attention like physical pressure. Every instinct urged flight. But where could he escape on foot across this boundless wasteland? As the warrior drew near, Marcus noticed something that chilled his blood. The man wore a necklace of small bones, and suspended from his belt was a scalp of auburn hair disturbingly similar to his own. The color matched Marcus's locks exactly, yet the warrior's eyes held no rage, no bloodlust. Instead, they showed something far more disturbing. They showed anticipation, as if Marcus should comprehend something completely beyond his grasp. The warrior halted 10 feet distant and uttered a single Apache word. Then he pointed directly at Marcus's chest and repeated it, his voice carrying reverent tones that made absolutely no sense. The Apache phrase hung between them like an unanswerable challenge. The warrior's weathered features showed no aggression, but his gaze demanded responses Marcus couldn't provide. Behind him, the 70 mounted braves remained statue still, their white plumes creating ghostly contrast against the harsh dawn sky. Marcus cleared his throat and attempted universal peace gestures, raising both palms slowly. "I seek no conflict. I aided your woman because she suffered. Nothing more." The warrior tilted his head as if Marcus had spoken something intriguing but incorrect. He repeated the Apache word, this time placing his palm over his heart before gesturing toward the ridge where Kaya had vanished yesterday. When Marcus still demonstrated no comprehension, the warrior did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a welcoming smile. It was the expression of someone who possessed secrets that would alter everything. The warrior reached into a leather satchel and withdrew an object that made Marcus's stomach plummet. It was his horse's headstall, the custom piece with distinctive silver medallions his father had bequeathed him. But the leather now bore small painted symbols that definitely hadn't existed yesterday. The warrior displayed the headstall and spoke again, using different Apache words, but maintaining the same reverent tone. He indicated Marcus, then the painted symbols, then Marcus again. The meaning was unmistakable. These symbols represented something about Marcus's actions, and that something warranted 70 warriors' attention. From the ridge, new sounds drifted down, singing, soprano voices weaving harmonies that raised Marcus's arm hair. But this wasn't a war chant. He had heard Apache war songs previously, and they sounded nothing like this. This melody carried celebration, gratitude, and something else he couldn't identify, something resembling mourning. The warrior noticed Marcus's bewilderment and nodded approvingly, as if Marcus's ignorance met expectations perfectly. He tucked the headstall away and produced something else, a second white plume identical to those carried by other warriors. He offered it to Marcus with both hands, speaking softly in Apache. Marcus stared at the plume. Accepting felt like agreeing to unknown terms, but refusing might prove worse. The warrior waited patiently, still extending the feather between them, while ridge singing grew stronger and more complex. Finally, Marcus reached out and accepted the plume. The moment his fingers touched it, the warrior nodded with profound satisfaction and turned to signal the others. Immediately, the entire formation began moving, not toward Marcus, but parallel to his position, as if preparing to escort him somewhere. But escort him where? And why did accepting a simple feather feel like signing a contract in an illegible language? The singing continued, and Marcus realized with mounting unease that the melody was approaching. More voices joined from somewhere behind him. When he turned around, his heart nearly stopped. Emerging from an unnoticed canyon was a procession of Apache women and children, led by an elderly man wearing elaborate feathered regalia. And there, walking beside the elder, but moving carefully due to her injured leg, was Kaya. She was alive, alert, and staring directly at Marcus with an expression mixing gratitude with something resembling pity. The elderly man with the elaborate headdress approached Marcus with ceremonial purpose. His weathered face carried authority earned through decades of tribal leadership. Behind him, the procession maintained their singing while watching Marcus's every movement with intense curiosity. Kaya limped forward, favoring her wounded leg, but moving with determination. When she reached Marcus, she addressed him in careful English, her accent thick, but words clear. "My grandfather wishes to thank the white man who restored life to his granddaughter." Marcus felt his confusion deepen. "I simply helped someone in pain. Anyone would have done likewise." Kaya translated his response to the elder, who listened intently before speaking back in rapid Apache. His tone suggested he was correcting something important. Kaya nodded and turned back to Marcus, her dark eyes grave. "My grandfather says your words are untrue. Most men would not have helped. Most white men would have ridden past or worse. But you sacrificed your most valuable possession to save an enemy's life." This is not something anyone would do. This is the action of someone who follows ancient codes. The elder stepped closer and placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice carried deep emotion transcending language barriers. Kaya listened carefully before translating. He says, "You have honored the sacred law of the horse gift. When a warrior gives his horse to save life, he binds himself to that life and that life's people. You did not know this law, but ignorance doesn't change the binding. You are now connected to our tribe in ways that must be honored." Marcus's mouth went dry. Connected? How? What does that mean exactly? The singing stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence felt ominous. The elder studied Marcus's face for a long moment, then spoke a single word in Apache. Every warrior on the ridge responded by raising their white plumes high overhead. The gesture resembled a salute, but Marcus sensed deeper significance than simple respect. Kaya's expression grew troubled as she translated. He says, "The connection requires a choosing. The sacred law demands that the giver of the horse gift must now prove whether his heart truly matches his actions. If yes, he joins the tribe as family. If no—" She paused, glancing nervously at the armed warriors surrounding them. "If no, what?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he didn't want the answer. "If no, the gift was false, and lies about sacred things must be punished. The horse would be returned to you, but your spirit would be considered poisoned. You would be marked as one who steals honor through false generosity." Marcus looked around at the 70 warriors, the elder's unwavering gaze, and Kaya's worried face. He was trapped between two choices he didn't fully understand, both of which would change his life forever. The white plume in his hand suddenly felt heavier than his missing horse, and he realized that his simple act of kindness had somehow triggered an ancient ritual for which he was completely unprepared. The elder spoke again, and this time his words carried finality. Kaya's translation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "The choosing ceremony begins at sunset. Until then, you are our guest. After sunset, you will be either our brother or our enemy. There's no third path." The village, the Apache settlement, was unlike anything Marcus had imagined. Concealed in a natural depression between towering stone formations, it consisted of traditional dwellings arranged in precise patterns, speaking of generational planning. What struck him most was the complete absence of hostility. Children watched him with open fascination. Women nodded respectfully as he passed, and men studied him with expressions suggesting they were measuring something he couldn't identify. Kaya walked beside him, her limp more pronounced now, but her determination unwavering. "You wonder why no one shows fear or anger toward a white man in their sacred place," she observed. Marcus nodded. "The thought had occurred to me. I expected something different. Fear and anger are for enemies. You are not yet an enemy, and you are not yet family. You are between worlds, which makes you sacred until the choosing ceremony reveals your true nature." She paused beside a large fire pit where several women were preparing food. "My grandfather wants you to understand what you will face at sunset." They approached a dwelling larger than the others, decorated with symbols that seemed to narrate stories Marcus couldn't read. The elder waited inside, seated on a woven mat with various objects laid out before him. Marcus recognized his horse's headstall among them, but there were other items too: a knife with an ornate handle, a small clay vessel filled with what looked like paint, and a bundle of sage bound with sinew. The elder gestured for Marcus to sit across from him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ritual and tradition. Kaya translated carefully, pausing frequently to ensure accuracy. He says the choosing ceremony has 3 parts. First, you must demonstrate that your gift came from genuine caring, not from seeking advantage or glory. Second, you must show that you understand the sacred nature of sacrifice by making one yourself. Third, you must prove that you can put the welfare of the tribe above your own survival. Marcus felt cold sweat forming despite the dwelling's warmth. What kind of sacrifice? And how exactly do I prove that last part? The elder seemed to understand English better than he spoke it, because he responded before Kaya could translate. He picked up the ornate knife and held it so the blade caught light filtering through the dwelling's entrance. Then he spoke in Apache, his tone grave and ceremonial. Kaya's face went pale as she listened. When she translated, her voice was barely audible. The sacrifice is a test of trust. You must allow yourself to be bound and placed in a situation where only the tribe's mercy will save your life. If your original gift was pure, they will save you. If it was false, they will let you die as punishment for dishonoring their sacred laws. Marcus stared at the knife, understanding now why the 70 warriors had seemed so calm and expectant. They weren't here to fight him. They were here to judge him. And depending on that judgment, they would either welcome him as family or watch him die for the crime of false generosity. The elder set down the knife and picked up the clay vessel. He dipped his finger in the paint and drew a symbol on his own forehead, then offered the vessel to Marcus. The message was clear. The ceremony was already beginning, whether Marcus was ready or not. Outside, the sun had moved considerably toward the western horizon. Marcus realized with growing dread that he had perhaps 2 hours to decide whether to submit to a test that could easily kill him or to try to flee across open country on foot while being pursued by 70 mounted warriors. Either choice seemed like a path to death, but one would at least preserve his honor in the eyes of people who had already shown him more respect than he deserved. Marcus took the clay vessel with trembling hands, the weight of his decision settling on him like stone. The paint was still warm from the elder's touch, and its earthy scent reminded him of the adobe church where his mother used to pray. He thought about her now, wondering what she would have told him to do in a situation that no Sunday sermon had ever prepared him for. The elder watched patiently as Marcus dipped his finger in the paint. The old man's eyes held no judgment, only the kind of steady attention that came from a lifetime of watching people face impossible choices. When Marcus finally drew the same symbol on his forehead that the elder wore, the old man nodded with something that might have been relief. "You have chosen to trust us with your life," Kayak translated as the elder spoke. "Now we must prepare you for what comes at sunset." They led Marcus outside, where the entire village seemed to be in motion. Men were arranging stones in a large circle. Women were weaving long ropes from plant fibers, and children were gathering specific types of wood that Marcus didn't recognize. Everyone moved with the fluid efficiency of people who had performed these tasks many times before. But there was an underlying tension that suggested this ceremony was not routine. How often does this happen? Marcus asked Kaya as they walked toward the stone circle. The horse gift ceremony? Not often. Maybe once in a generation, if ever. Most people are not foolish enough to give away their only means of survival for a stranger. She paused, studying his face. Or brave enough. 3 young warriors approached, carrying what looked like ceremonial clothing. The elder spoke to them briefly, then turned back to Marcus. Through Kaya, he explained that Marcus must wear traditional Apache clothing during the ceremony, as his own clothes represented the world he was choosing to leave behind. As Marcus changed clothes, he noticed that the 70 warriors from the ridge had positioned themselves around the village perimeter. They were no longer watching him specifically, but their presence created an unmistakable message. There would be no escape once the ceremony began. The white plumes they carried were now attached to their horses' headstalls, creating an eerie visual reminder of Marcus's commitment. "Tell me about the first test," Marcus said to Kaya as she helped him adjust the unfamiliar garments. "The one about proving my gift was genuine." Kaya hesitated, glancing toward her grandfather before answering. "You must speak truthfully about why you helped me, but not just speak. You must allow the tribe's wisest members to question you while you are bound and unable to defend yourself with anything but words. They will ask you things designed to expose any hidden motives, any selfishness, any lies you tell yourself about your own goodness." Marcus felt his stomach clench. "And if they decide I was lying to myself about my motives, then the ceremony ends immediately and you are taken to the edge of our territory and released. Your horse is returned to you and you are free to go. But you are also marked forever as someone who cannot be trusted, and no Apache will ever help you again, no matter how desperate your situation." The sun had moved noticeably lower, casting longer shadows across the village. Marcus could see that the stone circle was nearly complete, and several elders had gathered near it, discussing something in low voices. Their expressions were serious, and occasionally one of them would look in his direction with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "What happens if I pass the first test?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Kaya's expression grew grim. "Then you face the second test, the test of sacrifice. And that one, my new friend, is much more dangerous than having your motives questioned." The ceremony. The sun touched the horizon as Marcus found himself seated in the center of the stone circle. His hands were bound behind his back with rope that felt stronger than leather. The entire village had gathered around the perimeter, their faces illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. The 70 warriors formed an outer ring, still as sentinels, their white plumes moving gently in the evening breeze. 5 elders sat facing Marcus, each one wearing elaborate paint designs that marked their status as judges in this ancient proceeding. The elderly man who was Kaya's grandfather sat in the center, flanked by 2 men and 2 women whose weathered faces spoke of decades spent making life and death decisions for their people. Kaya stood beside her grandfather, ready to translate. But Marcus sensed that some of these elders understood English better than they let on. The way they watched his face when he spoke suggested they were reading more than just his words. The questioning began gently. Why had he been in Apache territory? Marcus explained about searching for new grazing land after the drought had destroyed his small ranch. Where was his family? Gone, he told them honestly. His parents were dead from fever, his sister from complications in childbirth, and he had no wife or children of his own. Then the questions became more pointed. Had he helped Kaya because he hoped to gain something from the Apache people? Marcus denied this, explaining that he had expected nothing but trouble from his actions. Did he consider himself a good man who deserved reward for his kindness? This question made Marcus pause, because he wasn't sure how to answer honestly. "I don't know if I'm good," he finally said. "I just know that leaving someone to die when I could help felt wrong." The female elder to his left spoke in rapid Apache. Her tone was sharp and challenging. Kaya translated reluctantly. "She asks why you did not try to take me to your own people for medical care. Why give me to the Apache when you could have been seen as a hero among whites for saving me?" Marcus felt sweat forming despite the cool evening air. The question cut to something he hadn't fully examined in his own mind. Because she belonged with her own people. Taking her away from everything she knew would have been another kind of cruelty. The male elder to his right leaned forward and spoke a single sentence in Apache. Kaya's eyes widened as she translated. He says, "You speak of cruelty, but you condemned yourself to walk 40 miles through dangerous country with no horse, no weapons, and little water. Was this kindness to yourself, or was it punishment for some guilt you carry?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. His sister's face as she died because he couldn't get her to a doctor in time. His parents' graves that he had abandoned when the ranch failed. All the times he had chosen the safe path instead of the right one. Was saving Kaya an act of redemption or just another way to hurt himself? "Maybe both," he whispered, and the honesty of it surprised him. The 5 elders spoke among themselves in voices too low for him to hear. Marcus watched their faces, trying to read expressions that revealed nothing. Finally, Kaya's grandfather stood and addressed the crowd in ceremonial tones that carried across the entire village. When he finished speaking, Kaya approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "You have passed the first test. The elders believe your heart was true when you helped me." She paused, wiping her face. "But now comes the test of sacrifice, and I must warn you what they are about to ask of you. Even I do not know if I could do it. The ultimate test." 2 young Apache men approached Marcus with a wooden box that they set down beside him with reverent care. When Kaya's grandfather opened it, Marcus saw the contents and felt his blood turn cold. Inside were 5 arrows, each one marked with a different colored band and a small piece of leather with symbols painted on it. The elder lifted the leather pieces and showed them to the crowd, speaking in ceremonial tones that carried across the silent village. When he finished, Kaya approached Marcus with obvious reluctance. "The test of sacrifice requires you to choose which member of our tribe will face danger to prove your worthiness," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 of our people have volunteered to risk their lives for your ceremony. The arrows represent different trials, each one dangerous but survivable if the person is skilled and blessed with luck. Marcus stared at the arrows, horrified. "I don't understand. I'm supposed to choose someone else to risk their life for me? That's not sacrifice. That's cruelty." "That is exactly the point," Kaya replied. "The test measures whether you will allow others to suffer for your benefit, or whether you will find another way. Many who take this test choose an arrow immediately, thinking that someone else's risk is acceptable payment for their own acceptance into the tribe." The elder spoke again, and Kaya continued translating. "But there is another choice. You can refuse to select an arrow and instead offer to face all 5 trials yourself. This has never been done because no one can survive all 5 trials alone. It would be certain death." Marcus felt the weight of the impossible decision crushing down on him. Around the circle, he could see 5 Apache volunteers standing ready. There was a young man barely out of boyhood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, an older warrior with scars marking his arms, a teenage girl who reminded him painfully of his dead sister, and a man about his own age with a wife and small children visible in the crowd behind him. "What are the trials?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't help his decision. Kaya pointed to each arrow in turn. "The red arrow means crossing the rapids at Devil's Canyon at night. The black arrow means entering the cave where the mountain cat has her den and retrieving a stone from the deepest chamber. The white arrow means climbing the cliff face that no one has successfully climbed in living memory. The yellow arrow means walking alone into the territory of the rival tribe that killed 3 of our people last spring and returning with proof of peaceful contact. The blue arrow means allowing yourself to be bitten by a rattlesnake and relying on traditional medicine to save your life. Each trial represented almost certain death, and Marcus was expected to choose which innocent person would die for his acceptance into a tribe he had never asked to join. The 70 warriors watched from their positions around the village perimeter, their white plumes now seeming less like decoration and more like markers for a funeral that had not yet happened. Marcus closed his eyes and thought about his sister's final words to him. She had told him that real courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about doing what was right even when fear consumed you. She had also told him that some things were worth dying for, and protecting innocent people was at the top of that list. When he opened his eyes, Marcus looked directly at Kaya's grandfather. I won't choose an arrow. If someone has to face these trials for my acceptance, it will be me. All 5 trials tonight. The resolution. The elder's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes that might have been respect. The crowd murmured in surprise, and the 5 volunteers looked at Marcus with expressions ranging from relief to amazement. But it was the reaction of the 70 warriors that surprised him most. As one, they removed the white plumes from their horses' headstalls and raised them high above their heads, creating a forest of pale feathers against the darkening sky. Kaya's grandfather rose slowly from his seated position, his weathered face showing deep emotion as he studied Marcus's resolute expression. The elder spoke in Apache, his voice carrying across the silent village with the authority of absolute decision. When he finished, the 70 warriors responded with a sound Marcus had never heard before, a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the earth itself. Kaya stepped forward, tears streaming down her face as she translated her grandfather's words. He says, "No man in the history of our people has ever offered to face all 5 trials alone. Such willingness to die rather than cause harm to innocent people proves a heart that is already Apache, whether the blood runs Apache or not." The elder continued speaking, and his next words caused visible shock among the assembled crowd. Kaya's voice shook as she translated. He says, "The trials are ended. You have already passed the test of sacrifice by proving you would rather die than allow others to suffer for your benefit. The horse gift law is satisfied, and you are declared brother to our tribe." Marcus felt confusion mix with relief. "But I haven't actually done anything yet. I just said I would." The elder smiled for the first time since Marcus had met him, and when he spoke again, his words carried gentle wisdom. Through Kaya, he explained, "The trials exist to reveal the heart, not to cause death. A man who chooses certain death over possible harm to others has shown his heart completely. No further proof is needed." What happened next took Marcus's breath away. The 70 warriors dismounted in perfect unison and began walking toward the stone circle. As they approached, each one knelt and placed his white plume at Marcus's feet, then removed something from his belt or saddle pack. Marcus watched in amazement as a pile of offerings grew before him. Beautifully crafted knives, hand-woven blankets, carved jewelry, and finally, one warrior brought forth Marcus's own horse, now wearing new Apache tack decorated with symbols of honor and respect. The lead warrior, the same gray-haired man who had first approached Marcus that morning, stepped forward and spoke in careful English. "White brother, we came here to witness judgment. We expected to take a body away for burial or to escort a new tribal member to our camps in the mountains. We did not expect to meet a man worthy of the greatest honor our people can bestow." "What honor?" Marcus asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. The warrior smiled. "You are invited to carry the protection of 70 families. Each plume represents a warrior's pledge that your safety is as important as the safety of his own children. Each gift represents a household that will shelter you, feed you, and defend you as long as you live. This has been given to only 3 white men in all our history, and never before to a man who was not born among us. Kaya's grandfather approached Marcus and placed both hands on his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of sacred ceremony. He says, "You came to us as a stranger who gave a gift. You leave as a brother who received 70 gifts in return. Your horse was returned with honor markings that will ensure safe passage through any Apache territory. But more than that, you have shown our people that some white men understand the true meaning of courage and sacrifice." Marcus mounted his horse, feeling the weight of 70 white plumes tied to his saddle, and the warmth of acceptance he had never expected to find. As he prepared to leave the village, the entire tribe gathered to see him off, their faces showing respect that would have been impossible to imagine just hours before. Kaya approached his horse one final time. "Where will you go now, brother?" Marcus looked toward the horizon where his old life waited, then back at the Apache village where he had discovered something about himself he never knew existed. "I think I'll head north toward the mountains. I hear there's good grazing land up there, and it seems I have some new neighbors to get to know." The 70 warriors mounted their horses and formed an honor escort as Marcus rode out of the village. Their presence around him felt like protection, family, and home all at once. The white plumes on his saddle caught the starlight, marking him forever as a man who had been tested by fire and emerged as something greater than he had ever imagined possible. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.